I want to welcome you all here to the very first, not only of this year, but the first ever lecture in the Dumanian lecture series, which focuses on the history and culture of Armenia. We're very, very excited to be able to inaugurate this series. And we want to, particularly on behalf of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and on behalf of the University of Chicago, to thank the Dumanian family for their generosity. Over many years, they have supported a visiting professorship in the field of Armenian studies, and this year they have very kindly agreed to expand their support so that we can not only have the visiting professorship but also a series of lectures related to Armenian life, history, and culture. And so that's a great thing, and it's a great thing to see all of you here tonight, especially since we're in the first week of the term, and usually people their hair is on fire and they're at 6s and 7s and they can't make it to an event. So I'm thrilled to see everyone here. Perhaps I should have said my own name. My name's Holly Shissler. And without further ado, I will ask Professor Harutyunyan to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see a nice group of people here who are interested to hear everything about Armenian art. So we are very much delighted and very much lucky to have today Christina Maranci, who is the most and the only one actually in the field of Armenian art history at this moment. And she works at Tufts University. She is, I learned that she is even a chair there of art history. So she is the Arthur Dadian and Ara Oztemel Chair of Armenian Art and Architectural History at Tufts University. She has had visiting positions. One of it was here at the University of Chicago, I believe in 2000. She was also a visiting professor at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan. She's the author of 3 books and over 60 articles and essays on medieval Armenian art and architecture, including most recently The Art of Armenia, an introduction with Oxford University Press. So that's, came out in the fall of last year. So go to Amazon, get the book. Her most recently published monograph on the 7th century architecture of Armenia won the Sona Aronian Prize for Best Armenian Studies monograph from the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, and also the Karen Gould Prize for Art History from the Medieval Academy of America. Maranci has engaged with the cultural heritage of Armenians for over a decade, working on historically Armenian churches and monasteries in what is now Eastern Turkey. Her campaigns for the Cathedral of Meren near Ani in present-day Eastern Turkey resulted in its inclusion on the World Monuments Watch List for 2015-2017. So without further ado, let's welcome our guest speaker today, Christina Maranci.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Oztemel. Thank you, Holly. Thank you to Near Eastern Languages, and is it cultures or civilizations? Civilizations. Thank you so much. And a very big thank you to the Dumanians for sponsoring this lecture series. Oztemel is correct. I was here. I taught here for a quarter back in either 2000 or 2001 with the Dumanian visiting professor series, and I was amazed at the quality of the students. You guys are so smart, and it was really important for me because I was just finishing my doctorate, and to have the opportunity to teach such smart students, and such a prestigious institution meant so much for me as my career went along. It was really important to have that opportunity. So I'm so thankful to the Dumanians and to the University of Chicago for having me. That was just really a career building moment for me. So I'm thank you. Thank you. All right. what else? So who am I? Yes, I teach Armenian art at Tufts University, and I wrote this book, which I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, why I wrote it, and what it's all about. It's called, as you can see, The Art of Armenia. And yeah, so I've been teaching Armenian art, I would say, at University of Chicago, so going back 18 years. I've been teaching it for a long time. And one of the things that I found was that it was really hard to give students readings on Armenian art. Like, what is there to give them? And so that was one of the reasons that I wrote it. I wrote the book also just because after teaching, Armenian art for how many years, I thought it's time that I have my own voice. I teach this subject in my own way. I kind of doing it. I didn't really, I didn't have a mentor in grad school who was an Armenian art specialist. He was a Byzantinist, and I was very glad to learn from him. But I didn't learn from someone who presented the material in a particular way that I inherited. So I kind of was making it up as I went along. But it's been 20 years, and you have your own sort of you start to sculpt your field in a particular way. So I wanted a book, an accompanying textbook. And looking around, there really wasn't anything that I could use. So there are, and forgive me if you know this already, but there are two surveys of Armenian art that were produced, in both of them in the 80s. They were both written originally in French and then translated. And they are useful each in their own way. But particularly the bigger one, that I did try one semester to assign readings from, and it did not go well. That one assumed a level of familiarity with the material that was way beyond what a typical American undergraduate would know. So I'm just going to give you an example. Let's see where we are. Oh yeah. So on the 6th century Basilica of Yereruk in the Republic of Armenia, a beautiful big basilica, an example of early Christian architecture in Armenia. This is what you read in that book. And if you're an undergraduate and you read, the general aspect of Yereruk evokes the large Syrian basilicas of 6th century, in parentheses, Turmanin, Rueha, that's not going to mean much to you, as like a sophomore in college. So I really saw, a need to just sort of explain this material in a very, in a basic way, accessible way, but at the same time, to do something else, to incorporate all the wonderful scholarship that has happened since the 80s, not just in the field of Armenian art and archaeology, but also just generally in the discipline of art history. I mean, art history's changed a lot since the 80s. And so how could I write something that would both be accessible to students and also capture this these new discoveries and new approaches, new methods, new monuments that we've found or excavated. So that was what I had in mind. The other thing I wanted to do is I thought that for the Armenian community, which I'm a part of in Boston, those are my people, I thought there was a real need to explain Armenian art within the discipline, the context of the discipline of art history, because we all love Armenian art. It goes without saying. My parents had their Armenian art books at home, and I looked at them. But why? Who paid for this art? What does it mean in its own context? Why does it look different from that? All the questions that we ask as art historians, I didn't know about. And I think that there was a way that I could give to the Armenian sort of heritage readers something about where Armenian art fits into the discipline of art history, into the discipline of medieval history, that would be useful. So that was the plan. And all of this, of course, as you know, in a world in which there's really a vacuum in terms of teaching Armenian art in the States, for sure. But it was a fun process, and for those of you who are engaged in writing projects, it can sometimes be lonely. But this one, it took me about three or 4 years on and off. I was not on leave while I did it. I worked my way through, but I learned a lot. You might think, oh, it's just an introduction. How much can you learn? But it's amazing how much you can learn as a specialist in your own field And it made me more convinced than ever, and I hope to convince you tonight, that this field has so much to offer. And it's criminal that American students don't get more exposure to this material. It's outrageous to me. And the more I learn, and maybe I'm a fanatic, but the more I learn, the more I think, but you're shaking your head, so that's good. All right, moving on. So the one, oh, you know what? Let's turn the lights. Can we turn the lights down a little? I'm just gonna go. I'll go to Starbucks. I'll be back in a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. That's pretty good. Okay, see you later. No. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. There we go. There you go. So, don't fall asleep. All right. Okay. Turn it on. Come on. You'll get used to the dark. That's better. So I wrote a very timid email to the person at Oxford University Press, and I'm telling you that 20 years ago, if I had sent such an email, I would have gotten no response, because things are changing in Armenian art, in the field of maybe Armenian studies too. I don't know, maybe. But she wrote back, and she was thinking, yes, this might be a good thing to do. Let's pursue it. Write a prospectus, and we'll talk about it. So what I envisioned was a book that dealt with Armenian art, broadly speaking, sort of material culture, from the beginning of time to the 17th, early 18th centuries, which is pretty much within my comfort zone. I'm a medievalist. And so the modern, for me, I felt like the modern world, different, other stuff going on. I would leave that to maybe a second volume for someone else to write. And yeah, so I got the reviews back. It's always fun, find out what people really think of you. And one of the reviews said, she's a medievalist. She really shouldn't be talking about ancient. Like, no, she can't talk about that. And of course, that made me angry whenever you hear things like that. Like, why are you telling me what I can do? And I felt, too, that the pre-Christian material was really important to include. It's true, I'm not a specialist in this material. I'm a specialist in Christian and beyond. But to start with the 4th century, to me, felt really artificial. So, because people in historical Armenia, the lands of Armenia, had all around them the pre-Christian landscape, which was, and that whole thinking about sort of the memory of the past is something that was studied so well by Adam Smith and Lori Khachaturian, who were here at Chicago, maybe before your time, but anyway. It's wonderful, the work that's been done by archaeologists in working in the Republic on the pre-Christian past. And it would, to me, seemed really wrong to ignore all that, particularly when you look at it. This is Van Fortress, so in the Van region, in the sort of southern part of what's now Turkey, but southeastern part of what is now Turkey, part of the Urartian world. This was certainly not, it hadn't vanished during the 4th century. When Armenians converted to Christianity, it was there still. So why are we ignoring this early material culture? Plus, some of the most exciting discoveries have been made in, let's say, Bronze Age Armenia. Remember the shoe that was discovered and the wine? And so why ignore all that? It just didn't seem right to me. So my first chapter is on I call it Ancient Armenia, and it's a kind of convenient term for me to use for everything from Paleolithic, which can get really tricky to date, to into the period on the eve of the conversion to Armenia of Christianity. That's a long period, and it's so complicated, and it was the hardest chapter I wrote, for sure, because it was really something that wasn't even art history as much as anthropology and archaeology. So what I tried to do in this chapter was, and this I looked everywhere to find a good sort of comprehensive study in English of ancient Armenia to no avail. So I realized there is a real need for something like this. And so what I looked at was things like studies of Urartian fortresses. I mean, the chapter runs the gamut, talking about the different periods. But for example, this this plan of a Urartian site in the Republic, Erebuni, has been studied really interestingly, again by Adam Smith, who's worked on spatial analysis to show that essentially Urartians were really into storage. They loved storage. They really did. It would have kind of fit right in with the... Anyway, and also they like to control movement. So if you kind of look through this plan and you look at you don't get to make too many choices when you're moving through this plan, which is really interesting too. So to what extent this tells us something about the way they were controlling and even surveilling the people, the subjects within their fortress is very interesting. So I try to give readers both a general sense of what is, Urartu, when is it, but also what the newer scholarship is saying about it. That was important. I also wanted to insert always a little bit of my own, sense of these objects, pre-Christian objects, as an art historian. This is a beautiful example of bronze work from Urartu, and speaks very much to connections with the Assyrian world and Assyrian visual traditions. And maybe just looking at this, you think of the Lamassu that we know of from the Assyrian palace context. And so it seemed to me a very interesting moment to ask, thinking about the way art history is moving now, to ask, well, okay, yeah, we can see connections here with the Assyrian world, but why? What does it mean? How would it have been received in a local context? And there are questions beyond just, all they did was copy Assyrian traditions. We've moved beyond that, thankfully, in art history. So then it sort of allows us to meditate on, well, what were the attractions about this Assyrian tradition that drew patrons, makers to integrate those forms into Urartian visual culture. I would say the most interesting thing for me in the pre-Christian chapter was this, what used to be considered, again, kind of like, not great, but now we're thinking differently about the ancient world, and that is that we find a culture, a material, a corpus of sites and objects and images that don't fit into tidy categories of Mediterranean or the ancient Near East. It doesn't work. And you can really see that very well if you look at these two raitans, or raita, on the left, one that is evocative of Persian, particularly think of Persepolis, a Achaemenid relief sculpture. And on the right, you can see a raitan with its repoussé designs, which is connected to the Hellenistic world. Look at the barefoot figure with the drapery and so forth. So this, and we can see that sort of connection to the ancient Mediterranean also when we look at this wonderful statuette that was excavated from Artashat Artaxata, which speaks very clearly about an interest, a desire to see Hellenistic forms. This is a beautiful example of kind of Hellenistic sculpture, wet drapery, contrapposto. It has it all, but it doesn't form part of study for classical art historians. You won't, if you look in a book on Hellenistic art, you're not going to find this. And one could say the same about some of the objects that connect with Achaemenid art. I'm being a little provocative here, but what I'm trying to say is ancient art of Armenia is sort of both looking towards the Mediterranean and looking at the ancient Near East in ways that defy easy categories of here's your ancient Near Eastern art, here's your classical art, and let's move on. Armenia is both and neither in a way, and I thought that was very exciting and something instructive for students to see. It's not a drawback. In fact, I think it's something that shows how we need to rethink art history to accommodate this tradition. That maybe art history as it stands now doesn't work for a subject like Armenia. Just a famous example, when you go to Armenia, you go to Garni, the Ionic structure of Garni, which again speaks to that connection with the Mediterranean. I was surprised as a non sort of ancient specialist, how little scholarship there was on these, what I thought were very famous objects. When you start looking, I didn't find a whole lot, which was kind of disappointing. I thought there should be more. So, okay, moving on. Okay, where are we? Oh yeah, so now we get into my comfort zone a little bit. We move into the Christian period. And this drew very much from my own previous book on the 7th century. So that was fun. And in fact, this was my sample chapter, which seemed to go over well with OUP. So that was nice. But what you're looking at here is a really fine example of the building tradition of 7th century Armenian churches. And what's very typical of this moment in Armenia is that and when I speak of Armenia, I'm talking here about historical Armenia, the Republic, what's now Eastern Turkey, southern Georgia, Azerbaijan, northern Iran, this sort of large swath, in its largest swath. But the churches built in the 7th century are astonishingly abundant, diverse, refined, and tell us a lot about the people who made them, because many of them are inscribed, and they also have sculpture, and they're also painted. So there is a corpus, hundreds of churches that belong to the 7th century, a moment where in Byzantium, broad brush for a moment here, you don't have this kind of level of productivity or this level of surviving monuments. And look at, and I think you can see yourself, these are carefully designed buildings. And they seem to emerge with fairly few preparatory steps. So in my previous book, there's been a lot of wonderful work cataloging the various types of plans and the construction technique and this sort of kind of big study done, catalogs, I would say, of the architecture, but less work that kind of hones in on specific monuments in huge, painstaking, painful detail, which is what I did in my previous book, because I wanted to know who built these, why. And I found it really, for me, it became then a more interesting project, because I like architecture, I like the formal qualities of architecture, but I also like the social questions and the economic questions and the political questions. And we know that the 7th century was a moment, sort of an unparalleled moment in history, where you have in the area of historical Armenia, you have the Byzantines and you have the Sasanians and the end of the Sasanian world, and then you have the Islamic conquests. All of this happening in the 630s, 640s, and in the area where Armenia. So it's a moment of tremendous upheaval, and it's also a moment of tremendous productivity in terms of architectural culture. And probably my favorite monument is this one from the 7th century. I had to, obviously, one of the problems with writing this book is you have to choose. So I was given, I don't know how many words I was given, not a lot, maybe 80,000. So it's really more about what you cut rather than what you include. But I had to include Zvartnots, which is essentially a rotunda from the 7th century. It's a round church, but speaks so much to this moment when Armenia was in the midst of not just conflict, but in the midst of these political powers and their confrontations. And the churches are part of that. And if you dive deep into the history of the churches and you look at who built them, if you look at their inscriptions, if you look at their sculpture, if you look at their painting, if you look at their designs, you can see that they were not this kind of insular or backwater, but rather the monuments and their programs and their patrons were connected. They were connected to Byzantium. They were connected to the Islamic world, which was rising. They were connected to the Sasanian world. They were a part of this larger moment that was so important at the time, still is, and so that's what I tried to do. I tried to bring in some of my earlier book and put it in this chapter. I also wanted very much to talk about the visual culture, manuscript painting, and sculpture. Here I should say too, as with ancient art, there has been tremendously good work done on Armenian manuscripts in the Republic and also here for the past several decades. And so I was able to draw on all that. This on the left is a famous painting, 4 of the earliest Armenian manuscript paintings we have from the 7th century. It's called the Echmiadzin Gospels. And on the right is a sculpted stone stele. And if you go to the Met, have any of you been to the Armenia show at the Met? Okay, a few people. All right, so you saw stele like this one. These are large quadrangular obelisk-like structures that were set up outside, carved with relief, probably meant for veneration, commemorative objects. And they're fascinating because they show not just sacred imagery. You can see, this is maybe hard to see, it's also been somewhat battered, but there's a Virgin and Child and 2 angels, but you also see a figure we think is the first Christian king of Armenia, Turdat, because he has, if you look carefully, you see he has ears and he has a snout, and it speaks to the transformation, his transformation after he converted to Christianity back into human form. He was very naughty before that and was turned into a boar for being bad, but then when he this is very simplistic, but then he and it's also, I'm kind of, it's abridged and it's also cleaned up, but when he converted, he was given human form again. Here you see him kind of in between. I just want to show you this beautiful. So I love this manuscript. I think these faces are adorable. That's not a professional thing to say, but I love their faces. I love Gabriel. You see Gabriel peeking out from behind the throne on the right, and the Christ child. But this is just a wonderful manuscript that speaks to the sort of the 7th century moment. Mineral pigments are being used here, which have retained their intensity, as you can see. Wonderful image over here of a magus, magi, but that's plural, right? Yeah. Anyway, and you can see him, if you compare this to contemporary Sasanian seals or coins, you can see the same profile, same almond-shaped eyes, same drop pearl earrings, same fluttering scarf. It's amazing. So it really, here you have in this image, a Christian image, but it's very much about the old religion of Armenia, Zoroastrianism, paying homage to the new religion. So it's a wonderful, I mean, this really, I think, speaks so well to how Armenian art, it's not just about pretty pictures, but it is giving us this immediate, incredibly rich, complicated window into a past. And that's another reason that it should be studied. How are we doing on time? Okay, so the first chapter, Ancient Armenia, second chapter was on early Christian Armenia, roughly 4th to 7th centuries. And then the third chapter was on what I call the Age of the Kingdoms. And so after in the 7th century, you have the Islamic conquests. So Armenia becomes part of the Islamic world until the 9th century. And in the 9th century, you have a kingdom that emerges in Armenia, the Bagratid kingdom. And they establish their sort of territory in the north, capital city Ani. In the south, you have another kingdom emerging called the Artsruni, and they have Van. Remember we saw Van Fortress, that's sort of their region. So this was a period after a couple decades where we don't have a whole lot of information. I'm talking about the period of the Islamic conquests. Things kind of slowed down in terms of artistic production, we think, although that period is being rewritten now by historians. It's very interesting. But in terms of architectural production and manuscripts, et cetera, we start to see a resurgence in the 9th, but really more the 10th century with royal patronage. And so this is a picture of Ani, the city of Ani, medieval city of Ani. How many of you been to Ani? Maybe? All right. Oh my gosh, look at this. All right, great. So you know where this is. This is at Ani looking from the citadel, which was the oldest part of the city, down to this kind of peninsula. And you see there's a church at the See, there's a church right up there. Probably 10th, 11th centuries. You're not really supposed to go there. So I hope none of you did. It's actually kind of off limits. I got in big trouble for going there. I got a police car ride back to Kars after that. Anyway, all right. So this is the cathedral, Ani Cathedral, and again, what struck me is many of us know Ani. It's one of the very few deserted medieval cities, uninhabited medieval cities that there are. There are some others, but it's one of the very few. And if you've been there, you know this is a staggeringly beautiful site, massive site. Hard to take good pictures. I mean, this is a good picture, but I always look online and find better pictures than my own pictures of Ani. But there's very little in English that's really good enough, to my mind, on Ani, because this architecture needs, I think, it needs to be carefully communicated. So this is the cathedral. It was built 989 to 1001 by the Bagratid King Sambat, and then finished later. But it is a beautiful example of the architecture of the Bagratid period, in the age of the kingdoms. And I want you to notice really how refined the masonry is, and how carefully designed the exterior is. It's hard to really do justice to it, but here I'll show you the inside. And the plan too, I think, is really instructive. So you have this plan of the structure, which itself is a kind of interesting two-dimensional work. I mean, obviously this was made in the modern period, but it's very symmetrically and carefully laid out. And in the interior, you can see those profiled piers. There's no reason to make them. I mean, you don't have to make them to make the building stand up, but see how carefully they're profiled and how they again, kind of create this very sophisticated, muscular space that is expressive. And so I very much wanted to introduce the student to this aesthetic, to an architectural aesthetic. And then maybe ask, well, why is there this aesthetic? Where does it come from? I mean, one thing I do, again, try to do in my book is ask questions and to give students possibilities of maybe pursuing those questions. So why do we get this wonderful vertical aesthetic at this time? And how does it relate to what we know about architects at the time? And in fact, we do know who the architect was. We know he went to the Hagia Sophia and repaired the Hagia Sophia in the 10th century. What did he learn there? What was it like to go to the Hagia Sophia, work in the scaffolding on the dome there, and work on this structure? So what did it mean in terms of ambitions? So there's so many interesting questions to ask, and I really did hope that my book would allow students to do that. Another piece of what I did in this chapter, and then I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end in terms of cultural heritage, just looking at the time, is talk about the monuments outside of Ani, but in what is now Eastern Turkey, that are abandoned, in perilous condition, and mostly inaccessible. So my last trip to the region was in 2016 at the time of the attempted coup. I haven't been back since, but I felt like already things were tightening up in terms of what you could see and what you couldn't see. This was a monument called Oztemel, which is, again, the aesthetic, I think you can see, having seen the Cathedral of Ani, you can see the same kind of aesthetic here, very, very carefully designed. Those attached colonnettes creating kind of web around the structure, but you also can notice that it's in terrible condition. We think it was dynamited from the inside, which would explain the holes blown out from the outside as opposed to like falling rocks. But it is still a structure of staggering beauty, and staggering in part because of the landscape. So there was this attention in Armenian architecture to the siting of monuments. And so how can we understand that? To what extent can that be read, for example, theologically? There are lots of interesting questions to ask. What does it tell us about the relationship between the church and the land on which it was sitting? But again, a difficult church to get to. So one hopes that a church like Oztemel and many others that are all around Ani, but are on the Turkish side, will be accessible in part so that they can be stabilized. This, as you can see, is in very bad condition. So is Ani Cathedral. So one other piece here is to raise awareness about monuments at risk, and that's what we're dealing with here. So another thing I did was talk about the Artsruni. I mentioned the kingdom of the Artsruni in the south, where the Van fortress was, and one has to talk about this most famous of churches. Anybody? Oztemel, thank you. Okay, Oztemel, yeah, which is an amazing church on an island in Lake Van. And so, it was fun for me to work on this because I could kind of browse all the there has been wonderful English language scholarship on this monument. And I should say, again, general remark about the book, that I chose for this book, to try to stick as much as I could to English and broadly European language scholarship, so that students who were not proficient in Armenian or Russian, and those are the two big languages in which a lot of the scholarship is in, so that they could at least do some preliminary research. And then maybe they would want, to keep going, but to give them a start so that it wasn't like just a closed door. That seemed important. So Oztemel is a great example where we have lots of work that's been done on this church, and I was able to sort of, really talk about that and talk about the scholarship and the scholars, because that's important too. This book is really a celebration of the scholarship that's been done for the past several decades. And just some details of Oztemel and the relief sculpture, a very different architectural style, but roughly the same time as what we saw at Ani, but here down south, they do it differently. And you have figural scenes, like this wonderful scene of the whale. This is the whale vomiting Jonah up. Jonah's right here. It's not very whale-like, but if you think about the fact that this is made in the 10th century, that you have trade of textiles, and you think about textile motifs at this time in the Islamic world, then you can, and in the Byzantine world, there are these wonderful motifs that really transgress geographical traditions of manufacture. The senmer of this wonderful creature is part of that, the traveling motif, vocabulary of traveling motifs. So we can do I do a lot of wonderful comparisons with textiles in my classes. You're probably wondering, well, where's all the rest of the stuff? Why is it just architecture and manuscripts? And traditionally, and stone sculpture, and traditionally Armenian art kind of is about the big three: churches, manuscripts, and stone sculpture. But there's a lot else, and I really wanted to highlight the other kinds of material cultures that we have. So we have textiles, we have wood sculpture, we have metalwork, we have ceramics. There's so much. And so I wanted to be as inclusive as I could be about that. So a wonderful capital, which is now in the Met Armenia show. This is also, I think this one is in the Met Armenia show. So a censer, a incense burner on the right, with scenes of the Annunciation and the Visitation, gospel scenes, and then this wonderful wooden capital that speaks to connections with the Abbasid world, most likely, in terms of its designs. So again, we're looking at art that is connected to its neighboring traditions. The other thing I wanted to do in this book was speak about how these objects would have been experienced. And so when we look at an incense burner, or we look at that throne ornament from the Urartian world, how would somebody have seen them? And we see it in a PowerPoint, but that's like so many times removed from how it would have been understood and seen and felt, experienced by a contemporary viewer. So thinking about, for example, the movement of when we go to church, or you see an incense burner being swung around, you're not looking at it statically like this. You don't get a chance to do that, but you smell it, you hear it because it has bells on it, and you have more of a vague sense of how it's working maybe. So there are a lot of, I wanted to give, this is of course a piece of what we do as art historians now. We think in terms of, What's the phenomenology of this object? So I wanted to also to open that methodology up to an object like this, but it could be done for many. So manuscripts, how are we doing on time? I'm going to speed up a little bit. Manuscripts from the Age of the Kingdoms. We start seeing more and more manuscripts at this time. It's really important it was important for me to say that you have a multiplicity of styles that emerge in painting. So I wanted, sometimes I feel like art historians and non-art historians sort of all are like, we don't need to talk about style. Style's boring, and what is style anyway? But actually, it's really interesting to try and describe what's going on to create, for example, the roundness of that neck. So I love doing that. I love talking about, for example, the modulations of tone that lead us to see this as a round neck. And how this work is connected, for example, to Byzantine traditions of the same period. And that's very clear. We can do that. On the left is an image of the Virgin and Child from a 10th century manuscript that also is in this same, I would say the same kind of Byzantine or Byzantinizing style. But then this is very different. This is a manuscript that is actually in the States. It's the oldest Armenian manuscript that we have in the States. It's called the Walters Gospels of the Priest. And when I show this, sometimes my students laugh at me, like, why are you showing us this when we just looked at those elegant figures? But what it shows is that there was room in the Age of the Kingdoms to produce in both ways. You could connect this to economics as much as you want, or you could talk about the training of the artist, but the fact is this exists. People looked at it. It was part of their visual world. And so why? Why does it look this way? I found that to be very interesting, and the other piece of what I did in this book was I paid a lot of attention to texts. I wanted students to realize, even though I'm not giving them the Armenian scholarship, the footnotes on the Armenian scholarship, we need to look at the inscriptions. We need to see what things say in order to understand their meaning. That's important. So, what does this say? And for those of you maybe who are in Hrypsame's class, you can start to read these things. And this says, Urachler, it's Urachler Pergrial. It's about the Virgin. What do you say? Hail Mary, right? Hail Mary, full of grace, right? It's be joyful, and because you are going to bear the Christ child. So. And then in the colophon to this, which is the sort of scribal note, it talks about the pergrumen of the congregation. So this was made for the enjoyment, same word, enjoyment of the congregation. So to me, I look at this image and, it's not, maybe it's silly, I don't think so, but I can see that. I can see the joyfulness, maybe even more than I can see it in this image, So I think that what's wonderful about this subject is it sort of forces you to open up a little bit your idea of what is worthy of study, and so so that's the Age of the Kingdoms. We should move on now. Oh my gosh, what are we doing on time? It's getting late. We're gonna move. Okay, we're gonna go to Cilicia next. So one chapter is devoted to a kingdom that the Armenians started in southwestern Asia Minor, just north of Cyprus, in 1199. And this kingdom is called Kilikia or Cilicia, and it lasted until 1375. And it is a kingdom that was famous in terms of material culture for its fortresses. You see the example of Anavarza here. And these fortresses have churches. And this you can see, these are photographs by Gertrude Bell. Did anyone see that Nicole Kidman movie? Or maybe you know Gertrude Bell by other means. But anyway, she was a wonderfully important pioneering traveler, archaeologist, art historian in the late 19th, early 20th century. Yeah, and she took these photos, I think this is 1901 or something. She went to Anavarza, and she talks about how she was taking pictures there and snakes were falling on her head. Like this, she disrupted a den of vipers or something, and they were all falling in thuds on her head. But she took these amazing photos. But the reason I wanted to show you this is because this is actually spolia, reused material from the Byzantine town below Anavarza. This is reused, and there's an inscription here in Greek that you can't read now, but we know it because it was recorded. And it speaks to connecting this with what scholars are doing now. There's such interest in reuse and recycling of materials in the past. So what were the Armenians, this new kingdom, thinking when they're gathering up this Greek stuff and putting it in their own churches, and not in a haphazard way? They actually do this very carefully to create this arch. And in fact, the Greek inscription still makes sense, even though they've actually taken out several of the stones. This is not a semicircle, you can see. So there's a lot of really, I think, wonderful work that could be done exploring the material culture of Cilicia as with the question, how do you create a new kingdom? What's the material, what should the expression of that kingdom look like? And Cilicia is so famous for its manuscripts. So I'm going to kind of run through this a little bit fast. This is the famous artist Toros Roslin, who I loved doing the work for this because, there's been wonderful scholarship on Toros Roslin and Cilician manuscripts, but Toros Roslin was obviously well-versed in medieval painting styles from Europe as well as Byzantium. Best of all, though, he really knew his Bible. So when you look at one of his paintings, you can't understand it all unless you know all the gospel texts he's drawing from. So that door on the right shouldn't make sense in terms of the logic of the image, right? It's a sort of mountainous setting. The door has to do with another gospel. This is the Gospel of Luke. That's what the texts are. But the door is from the story of the incredulity of Thomas, which comes from another gospel. And then the Zechariah is in the background, the prophet, holding a text that's another text from another part of the Bible that's talking about some who doubted. And so what Toros Roslin is doing is bringing together the idea of doubt, of showing wounds into this single image. He's doing a kind of visual exegesis himself. And so it's so interesting, again, to see how rich this material is, how you can teach with it. It's not just about sort of visual sophistication, but it's about an interesting theology as well. Toros Roslin is fun to teach with too because of the way, though, he uses the page. So the Last Judgment, this is from the Walters, which has a wonderful collection of Armenian manuscripts. Last Judgment, and you notice these poor ladies that are being ejected from the kingdom of heaven, and they are the foolish virgins who did not light their lamps. Yes, and Toros Roslin is telling you this. He's saying they were so bad. They are going to be ejected not just from the story, but from the entire composition. We're going to push them to the outside. So you see them, here they are over here, and the apostles are here, and they're, like there's a door here, and they're saying, no, you're not coming in. So Roslin is very sensitive to the page and to the design of the page and the way he can use that to make meaning. Okay, we're going to go forward. So my favorite moment, I would say, in Armenian art is the late 13th century. We don't know the names of these artists, but they are producing some of the most flamboyant, astonishing painting, sort of hyper-expressive, hyper-sophisticated, hyper-lavish that you can imagine. I can't get enough of this. And I always show my students this and say, why do you never see this in an intro to art class? This is crazy. This stuff is so beautiful and interesting. I mean, look at the angel and the way he's turned in so many different directions. It's amazing to me. And then even look, just take an example, the shine on the knee of this figure. So I guess in the book I was really trying to ask the reader to look carefully, to look really carefully with me. The cover of my book, but also one of the most brilliant, I would say, examples of the way the art of Armenian Cilicia expresses a kind of worldliness, a connectedness to, in this case, East Asia. We know this was produced during the Yuan dynasty when the Mongol Empire reached China. We can think of all kinds of ways in which this painting makes sense in terms of connections with trade routes. We can think about it in terms of maybe diplomatic gifts of ceramics and textiles that would lead to these wonderful creatures that are affronting the bust of Christ. But at the same time, we need to be aware of what the text says. Again, I asked the reader to look at the text with me, because the text is from the reading for the Annunciation to the Virgin, and it tells us, it's a reading from Zechariah that tells us that all nations shall take refuge in the Lord, which is, so when you think about it, this is kind of a wonderful visual representation, not just of trade capital, not just of kind of cosmopolitanness, but also of a kind of the text itself. All right, and then my favorite, one of the very few times you get nudes in Armenian art, but here they are. Maybe you can find them for me. This guy. Oh yeah, how are we doing? Were you raising your hand? Oh yeah. We got it. I know we got to finish up. All right. Okay, and then there's probably Adam and Eve over there. Adam much more obvious over on the right, but I just love that. Okay, we're going to move forward to, we talked about Cilicia in the 13th century, moving back to Greater Armenia, which we call sort of the traditional homeland. We have an explosion of building. Mostly what we have are monasteries, monastic complexes. In this chapter, I try to give, this is yet another chapter, I try to give the reader a sense of the intellectual environment of these monasteries, as well as the culture that was built and sculpted and written. So that was important to me. But they're so interesting in terms, again, of architectural style. It's a moment where you have a kind of experimentation and innovation with vaulting techniques, tremendously complex designs. You have a fascinating and really it should be studied more appropriation of Islamic forms, like this wonderful Muqarnas vault. That's that central, almost looks like honeycomb vault in the center of this this structure, which is at Ani, 13th century structure at Ani. But again, you see those massive rib arches. So the 13th century in Greater Armenia is a period of I think, like in the 7th century, it's a period when you start seeing just new things just emerging. And in the 13th century, I think it's about connections with other cultures. And I should say that in the book, I also try to give the reader, as best I can, a sense of the history. And 13th century is very complicated. I mean, Armenia is the number of different sort of spheres of control over Armenia just change all the time. But you can see maybe that out of that you have, and maybe not in spite of it, maybe because of that, you have these tremendous sort of visual expressions. This is from Ganzasar, which is in the southern part of Armenia, and you have sculpture that is both in relief, those birds. You have perforations into the wall. You have polychrome. This is kind of this wonderful maroon and silvery circles. Can't really say enough about it. And the other piece with the monasteries is their landscape, the physical setting. All of these structures are built with tuff stone, which is like a volcanic, some of them are basalt, but they're all volcanic rock. And if you've been to Armenia and seen the monuments, you know how they change over the course of the day. This is Noravank in Sunik in the Republic of Armenia, and depending on the time of the day, the sun lights up the cliff walls and the church in this remarkable way. And it's an interesting observation, but again, you want to think, how was that understood? How did that inform the way people saw their monuments, saw the world around them, see the world around them? You couldn't have a book on Armenian art without Khachkars. We're getting to the end here. You couldn't have a book of Armenian art without Khachkars, which are these stone stelae that are carved with crosses. And the Met Armenia show happily has many examples of them. Again, why? Why does it look this way? Incredibly intricate designs. it was a fun but arduous task to try to describe them, which I did try to do carefully for each object, describe it. But this is, if you start looking at it, you realize how hard it is to describe. And it has so many different surfaces. It's not just one surface, it's multiple surfaces. Designs within designs. Nothing is sort of regular. And so I very much wanted to speak about it as a formal phenomenon, but also how this helped the mind to meditate on God, because that is what you were meant to do before these khachkars. They were sites of commemoration and veneration. So how does this extremely formal, extremely minute design help you, lead you in your meditations? Okay, we're going to move a little bit faster. Go to early modern. I know there's so much, and one wants to talk about it all. But early modern, that was a tough. It's always hard to sort of say, well, when does modern happen? And I follow pretty much the standard division that art historians have done before me for Armenian art, which is 17th. I put it into the early 18th century, when I think modernity for Armenian art kind of works. But I don't even like those categories anyway, because they don't really mean anything to me. But in any event, I had to create chapters. So I have a chapter that's essentially 15th to 18th centuries. And it deals with things like the merchants. So you have a new merchant network starting in the 17th century. It's created. The Armenians create this merchant network, and it in part what that does is it exposes Armenians to so many different cultures, including European print culture. And so we have in Armenian art of the 17th and 18th centuries a strong sense or a strong connection with print, European print culture. I think you can see that here. Here's an Armenian Bible made in 1666 using your Dutch prints, Dutch engravings. But then you have a painted manuscript from the late 17th centuries, and actually probably just not around the same time, made around the same time, that is also drawing from European motifs, for example, with the lily in the hands of Gabriel. I believe, too, even in the style of the painting. There's no nostrils. I mean, there's a really strong graphic design. It makes me wonder, what would it have looked like to see a print, in the 17th century, if you were a painter, to see this new technology? Wouldn't that be interesting in a way that maybe it isn't now? Or would you feel threatened? So, Okay, it's a pop quiz. I always do this in all my classes. One of these is a Cilician manuscript. The other is a 17th century manuscript. So, which is the older one? It's the 13th century one. You get an A. You get an A. Yeah, it's the one on the left. The one on the left is actually 13th century Taurus Roslin manuscript, but it was known to an artist in the 17th century in Sivas, Sepastia, where my own people are from. And he, Mikhail, loved Taurus Roslin. He dedicated his manuscript to Taurus Roslin, which is an amazing thing in the 17th century for a painter to do. And he painted this pretty much the same designs. You can see, not exactly, but similar. So it's an interesting moment. Again, the 17th century is a moment where you have all these new things happening with commerce, with politics. You have the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. Politically and economically and culturally, things are changing. But you also have a turning to the past and looking at the past. Both and Mikhail did that, and he did it actually. He was also a poet, and he even looked at some 13th century Armenian texts like Nerses Shnarali or 12th century texts, Nerses Shnarali, and wrote about them. And he was fascinating. He's not studied, really. He needs to be studied. Fascinating guy. All right, yeah, so you're right about that. And then we get to this guy. Okay, sometimes people work a little differently. This is a man. I wanted to include this because it's so different from anything else. And this is a painter who was working, an itinerant painter working on the eve of the deportations of Armenians to the Safavid Empire, where they would set up their merchant colonies. His name is Jacob Juchayetsi, and he lived in his own world, and this is the kind of thing he made. And his life was not easy. He wandered around from town to town in the Ottoman Empire, trying to make money, holding his books with him to sell them in order to move on. And this was God for him. This is an image of God. This is an image of the creation, and he shows God. And every page of this manuscript, God's face gets bigger and bigger. Why God looks like this, I don't know. My husband had this idea, and I should say that I thank him for all the ways he contributed to this book, but he had the idea that maybe when your life is that bad, maybe that's what God looks like to you. I don't know. But, yeah. So Hagop is in there too. And now I want to, there's so much we could say. I am actually going to close now. By the way, though, I do talk about the new churches of New Julfa that are beautiful. I get a chance to talk about women artists as well with this wonderful textile that was produced by a mother and daughter team in 1448. It's on, you can see it at the Met for the next 2 days, but they don't mention that it's made by women artists. We know that from the inscription. It tells us their names. And it's a wonderful image to think about because of who they show. This is Turdat, the guy who turned into a boar, right? This is Saint Gregory, the patron saint of Armenia. And this is Haripsime, who Turdat tried to have his way with. And she ended up preserving her innocence, but he was so angry he killed her. And but look at how they're shown here, quite peaceably. Imagine these are a mother and daughter team embroidering this. How are they going to show this scene? Why are they going to show it the way they are? So lots of interesting things, lots of potential to work. I could go on and on, but I'm gonna just close by saying that one thing that was important to me, and I'll use this as a kind of ending point. One thing that was important to me was to convey not just the history of Armenian art, but also the degree to which we are still custodians of this culture. It is still, these are objects, they're monuments, they're images that we need to take care of. And so part of what we need, and they're also part of the modern political world. We can't get away from that. And there's been a tremendous amount of scholarship on issues of trauma, on issues of cultural heritage, on the relation of the genocide with the monuments in places like Turkey and Azerbaijan. So it's, and to study Armenian architecture and art from the point of view of, as cultural heritage involves human rights, it involves law, it involves economics, it involves diplomacy, it involves bureaucracy, it involves all of these different pieces, and students can get involved, and they can, you know, there's room for other disciplines to be talking about these works. So that's sort of where I wanted to end it, because I thought that it really, one needs to talk about the role of the modern world in the fate of these monuments. So you're just seeing here on the upper left, I talk about these beautiful Khachkars that were made in Julfa in Nakhchivan, that were caught. They were caught on tape. The Azeri soldiers are destroying those Khachkars. We have that footage going back to the 90s. So that whole cemetery has been eradicated. We have the restoration of Oztemel, which was accompanied with a lot of controversy. We have the Toros Roslin Gospels that's in the Getty, that was part of a lawsuit that was issued by the Armenian Church because the manuscript was disbound and sold during the genocide. And then last we have the work at Ani on one of the churches that's happening right now. And so there's a lot of this material is not just in the past, it's very much in the present. So, okay, I think I'm done.
So I guess there would be questions.
Yes, please. So I was very interested when you were talking about the landscape and how you
Yeah.
in churches.
Yes.
Landscape. Could you speak a little bit more
Yeah.
semiotics of that?
Okay, I don't know if I can speak to the semiotics, but I can talk about it more. So yes, it's so interesting to me to think about what the land meant to those who were working with it. And when you see these very particular gestures, putting monuments at particular places, why is it being done? And I think you do need to do it site by site, but there's certain things we can say. For example, the landscape held meaning for medieval Armenians. Ararat, the place, it was of course for Armenians ever present on the horizon, as it is today, but it also was the place from which we know from 5th century tradition was the quarry for the first Armenian churches. So it's part of this tradition. We know in the earliest history of the conversion, Terdat goes up to Mount Ararat and quarries on his own back after he turns back into a human. He quarries all these big stones for the first churches. So it has this sense, Ararat has this sense of being a quarry for the sacred architecture of Armenia. There's a lot of work too that could be done with that I've done myself with the liturgy, like a foundation rite. So how do you make a sacred precinct? What are the steps to do it? What do you read from? What kinds of rituals do you perform? And what you get, and that's another thing that I think needs more study. That is how do you found a church? You know, as I mentioned, what do you do? What you learn is that there was a strong sense of the sort of the biblical, the theological meaning of a site, of God, the creator of the site as Jerusalem. I mean, these ideas really come through when you do you see what people were reading at the time when the sites were being sort of made sacred sites. So it's a very interesting moment, and the rite is perhaps as old as the 5th century. So that's another way to think about it. But I think just thinking in terms of why is this church where it was, like Konk? When you look at that site, and I won't talk too much about it, let me just go back. When you look at it, you can see that the church is built, sorry, this is annoying, but the church is built so that you can see the bedrock, you can see the raw, you can see pretty much the raw, striated bedrock, and then you get this kind of roughly processed masonry, and then you get this more finished masonry as you go up. And so there's this strong sense of a kind of, like a continuum between the land and the built structure. And I think that's an important observation too, and speaks to this idea of Ararat as kind of as not just a landform, but as a kind of part of that sacred world. And that speaks too to the fact that Armenians were performing veneration outside. There was not a kind of inside, as well as inside, but there wasn't a sense of kind of interior sacred, exterior secular, but at least I don't read it that way. So, yeah. Yes, please.
It just seems so astounding that something that finished is built right on the precipice.
Yeah. So I should say that I think there has been more falling. When I look at old photographs, you can see there's been some, I guess erosion would be the word, I don't know. But in any event, it's still, nevertheless, it's still very much, it would have been dramatic even when it was built in the 11th century. And that's quite common. Common isn't a great word, but there's a beautiful example, this speaks to the semiotics, is again, of a monastery in the Republic called Hovanavank. And at Hovanavank, it's built right on a gorge. And what's so wonderful about that is that in the church, there's a tympanum and it shows the wise and the foolish virgins, so the story we just talked about. And Christ is sort of expelling the foolish virgins, and the direction he's expelling them in, it would be just going right over the gorge. So there's this connection between that sort of the site and the imagery, sort of creating this kind of logic of the site. So, but that's what's actually wonderful too about working on Armenian architecture. You go to these staggeringly beautiful places. I mean, that's where most of the monuments are just so carefully situated. So.
If you
It's silly.
Eroding?
Well, yeah, it looks like I don't know if eroding is the right word. I'm not. I mean, I feel like I want to be a geologist to answer that, but I'm sure that it is maybe slowly. Unfortunately, this is one of those sites that hasn't always been easy to get to. It was actually off limits for many years. So how much we can say about sort of tracking its demise is hard to do, but it is a worry because that's really close to the edge right now. Yeah, and it's also behind is another big cliff. So there are rocks coming down from up above too. This isn't too far from Ani. Yes, please.
Can you talk about your process of studying these to go to the site?
Oh yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. Something I've learned over the years. I had some good advice when I started to do some field work, like take a picture of every facade. It's always the things that you don't take pictures of or record that are the things that you want at the end. But I think, it also depends on sort of what it's for, what I'm aiming to do. But I'll give you one dramatic example. When I got to the Church of Maren, which is it's in the military zone. It's on the Turkish side in the military zone. And I knew I only had a certain amount of time there. I knew that the soldiers were watching because there's a big, hill up above where they could see. There's a watch post, I think it's called. So I knew that I had to be really, really, really careful and fast and get everything I wanted. So I actually made a list beforehand. Okay, I want this, I want this, I want this. I'd never been there before because it was, not easy to get to. But I wanted to make sure that I did everything I needed to. So, basics would be you get every facade and you get the interior as much as you can. But the fun parts are usually the surprises. So when I got to Maren, and I actually spent a fair amount of time in the church because I didn't want to be seen, that's when I started to realize, oh my God, there's so much more painting in the apse than I thought. This church is covered in painting, and I'd never seen these paintings before. All of a sudden I'm seeing hands and so that helps you. Then you think, oh, next time I go to a church, I'm going to look for the painting. And what's so amazing is now I see so much more than I did. It's interesting with, in the case of Armenian art, if you're not looking, you may not see it. But once you start to look, now I go to the churches at Ani, so many of them are painted, but they're not published, or not a lot of them are published. There's much more that isn't. So it's kind of a roundabout. But when I first started, I tried to be as sort of regimented as possible. And now I'm starting a new book, and I'm gonna go back to that, sort of be really disciplined about just taking every side, every corner, you never know. You need a good camera too, so. Yes, please.
The Cathedral of Ottoman, you said that was being renovated.
Yeah, it had been, yeah.
I was last there in 2004, I think. So since then, because it looks really beautifully sort of yellow and sparkling.
Yeah.
I don't know about inside, if there was a problem.
Yeah. So the renovations, they were in the early 2000s. I don't know if it was before or after you went. They renovated, they did a lot of, they built some outbuildings in a very annoying way, which mean that you can almost not get good pictures of these astonishing sculptures on the west facade. You have to stand on like this air conditioning unit to do it, pretty much. But the other thing they did, which was more problematic, was they cleaned the interior painting program, and in doing so, they took off the outermost layers of the wall painting, so that you get now very strong outlines. You're getting really what's the word? The thing they put down first. But yeah, you're not getting. We've lost some things there. It was a problem too, because it was sort of seen by some as a publicity stunt too, because they did it, and then they performed a Badaraka Eucharist, Armenian Eucharist there. It's an example that people are definitely ambivalent about, I would say, in the Armenian community, so that's another thing. There's this sense that things are happening, and Akhtamar, Ani, and everybody is watching, and now you can. And so it's important for us to be educated as to, you know, what's good and what isn't good, because there is good restoration. The Surpergich, the church I showed you that's half there in the scaffolding, that's good. I think they're doing an excellent job with that, but I think we need to know, we need to be sort of informed as to what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate.
Are you working with, at all, do you work with a certain ministry of culture from Turkey?
Yeah.
Are you working with
Yeah,
them?
you have to. So
Yeah.
they own all the monuments, and so everything has to be done through them. But you know, my work has been done through the World Monuments Fund, and you need to have a kind of prestigious, usually like an American, although I don't know anymore. It used to be like earlier that you would work with a prestigious organization like WMF or UNESCO or ICOMOS, and they would be the go-between between the specialists, the sort of the knowledgeable specialists, and then the money, because the money comes from yet somewhere else, and then they would also be connected to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. So that would be a way to kind of keep it all, you know, organized, to say the least. It's complicated, which again is an interesting learning experience for students to see how complicated this can get. For example, what kinds of materials do you use? What's the best way to join one stone to the other? This is a church that's built in the 11th century, but is having problems. It's a 19-sided building that's half there with frescoes on the inside. It's complicated. So it was wonderful to see. It was wonderful to see all these different experts working together on it, and Armenian specialists, seismologists as well, engineers, everybody trying to figure out what can we do for this building. I mean, that's ultimately, I think that's good. So.
Thank you very much.